President of the United States in Milwaukee yesterday, Anne-Marie, and he participated in his very first town hall since taking office. And he addressed a wide range of issues related to the coronavirus pandemic, including setting a new goal for when every American can likely expect to have access to a vaccine.
When is every American who wants it going to be able to get a vaccine?
By the end of July of this year. When we came into office, there was only 50 million doses that are available. We have now, by the end of July, we'll have over 600 million doses, enough to vaccinate every single American.
When you say When you say by the end of July, do you mean that they will be available or that people will have been able to actually get them? Because Dr. Fauci...
They'll be available.
They'll be available.
They'll be available.
So that's an interesting distinction, Anne-Marie, right? Because having the vaccines available is different than me, you, Ryan Black, our Florida director, and everybody here at CBS News and across the country getting a vaccine. So that's an important distinction that the president made, and Anderson pressed him on. But one topic that wasn't up for discussion, former President Trump.
Look, for 4 years, all that's been in the news is Trump. The next 4 years, I want to make sure all the news is the American people. I'm tired of talking about Trump.
Yeah, he had another moniker for the former president. The former guy, he called him. The president called former President Trump the former guy. The president also sought to emphasize the need for funding in order to achieve those goals by pitching his nearly $2 trillion coronavirus relief plan directly to the public. So for more on this, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe. He is standing by for us at the White House. So Ed, as we heard, President Biden promised to have a vaccine, a coronavirus vaccine. He says people will be able to get one by the end of July, but he also warned logistical and distribution hurdles would cause a delay between when the doses are made available and when people actually get vaccinated. It's an important distinction. Biden administration also taking steps to expand access as states struggle with distribution. What are you hearing?
What I'm hearing there is more specificity and an earlier guaranteed date than we've been hearing from administration officials in recent weeks. Part of that confidence comes from the fact that the administration has now been able to purchase 100 million more vaccines from Pfizer, 100 million more from Moderna, and they know that it's likely in the coming weeks the Johnson & Johnson single-dose vaccine will be approved by the FDA and possibly getting into the arms of Americans by next month. So it's accelerating ever so slightly, but you know, end of July is a more specific timetable, and about 2-3 months sooner than some officials had been saying just a few days ago here at the White House. Those numbers keep moving, the targets keep moving, because they understand that there's issues with supply, there's issues with the logistics. As I fall off my stand here.
Be careful.
You know, so he was a little bolder last night in some of these predictions than I think some administration officials would be otherwise, knowing of the challenges that they're set to face.
The president also promised that the majority of K-8 schools would be open 5 days a week by the end of his first 100 days in office. Now, you know, we all saw the CDC guidelines, and the CDC connects, you know, the opening of schools to the virus within the community, the rate in which the virus is spreading in the community. And most kids live in what is called a red zone, at least right now. So do you have an idea of how the White House plans to achieve that goal? Because you can't open the schools until you get a handle on the infection rates.
You can't. And remember, we don't have federal control of schools. So he can set these goals and talk about all these things that he'd like to get done, but he's at the mercy of local school boards, of mayors, of county executives, of governors across the country who have to be the ones to help fulfill this pledge. And let's remind people, in December, during the transition, he said his goal was to have a majority of schools open by the end of his first 100 days. That's late April. Suddenly, right after he takes office, the goal was shifted. All K-8 schools, majority of them, open by the end of late April. Then there was this confusion about, well, 1 day a week at least. And then it said last night, no, that was a miscommunication. 5 days a week of in-person instruction for a majority of students and a majority of schools across the country. Again, a noble goal, but one over which he has very little control. There's also this concern about, do teachers have to get vaccinated beforehand? He says his preference is that they would be. Vice President Harris this morning in an interview saying the same thing. But the CDC doesn't necessarily say they have to do that, and Not every state is prioritizing teachers. So again, the patchwork of priorities and of systems in place, thanks to federalism, are going to result in different experiences across the country. And Republicans are catching on to this. They have been making hay over the fact that schools are not open and the confusion that's being caused by the CDC, by the president, by the myriad rules put in place by education officials across the country. And they feel that there's a real vulnerability there for the president, given that he's been so explicit and so bold in making that kind of a prediction. Also, as our reporting here has pointed out, how do you track that? There's nobody sitting there literally taking attendance of schools to see which ones are open and which ones are not, because it's done differently in each municipality, it's done differently in each state, and there's no federal tracker for our schools all open today. So it's kind of an interesting thing that he's put out there that could cause him some real trouble in 2 months.
Yeah, no, you're right, Ed, and you're already starting to see some Republicans looking to suburban women
Yep.
that are stuck at home, with their children, and they want their children back in school. That was a big constituency in the last election, and Republicans had lost some. There was some erosion there for the GOP. They're seeing an opportunity here. So you're right. The president really needs to clarify how this is going to going forward. Here's something else that I thought was interesting yesterday, Ed, in response to constraining the police while addressing racial injustice in this country, racial disparity. The president of the United States said he remains opposed to defunding the police. What I find really interesting about that discussion, there were two. One about defunding the police, and the other about forgiving $50,000 in student loan. The president, right off the bat, saying he's definitely not doing that. And it's interesting to me because you see a lot of Republicans. I have a lot of Republican friends who sometimes speak as if President Biden is the second coming of Bernie Sanders, and he's not. And you could see that in that pushback on two very important issues progressives have.
Yeah, and look, if you were paying attention to him, as many voters were during the campaign, that's consistent with what he said during the campaign, that he didn't think that a president could use his executive authority to forgive up to $50,000 of federally backed student loans. He did do $10,000. That is some relief, but there are those out there pushing for more, saying that there are too many Americans that are saddled by their federally backed student loans and they deserve to get more forgiveness. Notably, Senators Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren, among others, pushing for this idea, believing that it's something he can do. The president said last night he cannot, and that is not something that a lot of Democrats want to hear. On defunding the police, he said, no, let's not defund them. He had made that clear during the campaign as well. He never signed on to that theory that was adopted by many other candidates, and just said, look, you got to work on retooling the budgets of these police departments, finding ways to make it easier or different for them to do their job, so that we don't end up in situations like so many of the awful situations we've seen across the country, not only in the past year, but over too many recent years. But they haven't necessarily put out a specific plan of what he would do on that. I think part of that is because we don't yet have a Justice Department leadership in place, and we won't for at least a few more weeks. It's also because, as issue number one was last night, as issue number one will be here today at the White House again, it's all about the pandemic primarily. And it'd be very difficult to have conversations or get anything done on Capitol Hill until issues surrounding the pandemic are sorted out.
So speaking of issues surrounding the pandemic, there's the nearly $2 trillion relief bill that the president would like to see Congress vote on and hammered out. One component of that bill is an increase in the federal minimum wage to $15. It is a component of the bill that the president reaffirmed his support for during that town hall meeting. But we've also heard him say whether or not it'll be included in this nearly $2 trillion bill is a whole other conversation. I'm wondering if this is also an area where he may be at odds with some of the progressives in the party.
Yeah, well, look, it was first in that Super Bowl interview with Norah O'Donnell where he hinted that he now knows and understands that the specific call to raise the minimum wage is unlikely to end up being part of this final package. We know that there are at least two moderate Democrats in the Senate, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who said they don't want it in there because it has nothing to do with direct, urgent need for assistance based on the pandemic. But as you heard him say last night, yeah, in theory, he loves the concept of getting to $15 an hour, feels that there are too many people working in this country 40 hours a week and are still impoverished because of that, but signaled that if there were a debate about let's get to 12 to 13 over the next few years and then work towards 15 and set it up over a sliding scale of some sort, he'd be open to that. That's classic Biden. That's classic negotiation in public. And that's likely where the conversation over the minimum wage is headed. It will probably not end up being part of that bill. That will upset liberals in the House and the Senate, most notably Bernie Sanders, because he's been pushing for it and believes it should happen and it should be in there. But the politics of the House and Senate right now, given the close divisions, are such that they probably can't keep it in there and guarantee full Democratic support. And the president, even if that doesn't happen there, says he's willing to continue fighting for it separately. But if it's not part of one of these big bills, it's going to be an awfully harder fight.
Meanwhile, Ed, let me just briefly ask you about the former president. He issued a highly personal statement against Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell Tuesday, calling him a, quote, dour, sullen, and unsmiling political hack. As we know, the senator voted no on impeachment, but later held Mr. Trump practically and morally responsible for the assault on the Capitol. This is really interesting, Ed, because you've got this message from the president, who remains extremely popular in the Republican Party. Minority Leader McConnell is trying to manage a path for Republicans who are not necessarily Trumpists, but it does seem that former President Trump has the advantage. He remains extremely popular. There are polls out that suggest that if he decided to run again in 2024, which is a long way off, a lot of things could change, that he would be the one that people would want to vote for. So, and you're starting to see Republicans like Lindsey Graham and others sort of, rebuking McConnell and talking about his leadership position. What do you make of it? What are you hearing there in D.C.?
Few things. First of all, you would have thought that statement was issued by some of the Republican leader's Democratic critics. I had to read it twice. But that very well could have been submitted by any number of Democrats in this town who are not fans of Leader McConnell. But you got to look at what he told the Wall Street Journal in an interview published yesterday. And this is remarkably consistent for the minority leader. He says he's looking for Republican candidates who can win elections in November. In some states, that is people who are backed by the former president. In some states, it isn't. But at the end of the day, Minority Leader McConnell is trying to become Majority Leader McConnell again. And he knows that that requires supporting certain kinds of candidates in certain states that may or may not match up with the others in other places. And it's going to mean fealty to the former president in some situations and standing against him in others. And to McConnell, whatever it takes to get to the majority will work. He'll take his lumps from the former president. But what the former president is trying to do here is say to Republicans, you're either on Team Trump or you're on Team Mitch. And we will see over the course of the next roughly 2 years how that goes and what that means going into 2024. Do you subscribe to the win at whatever cost attitude of Mitch McConnell? Or do you subscribe to the you got to do it my way attitude of Donald Trump? Or do some candidates or some other candidate emerge from that field going into 2024 and say, there's a way to do both? And there's a way to take some of what the president did over 4 years and continue that and maybe leave the mean-spiritedness and the divisiveness behind. That's the argument that someone like Nikki Haley is making, for example, in that recent interview with Politico. But that is essentially the crux of the Republican Party over the next 2 years. McConnell's been rather successful at this, and he can point to history that says, look, when you nominate someone like Sharon Angle in Nevada or Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, it doesn't work. It might fire up Republican primary voters, but it does not win over the voters that we need to win in general elections. And that'll be the debate Republicans have amongst themselves for the next 2 years, and Democrats will just sit back and watch.
Indeed. Ed, thank you very much.
Take care.